Okay. Well, let's talk about we'll just start out with the handout on crime. So Hobbes gets into, more or less advice about, this is advice for the sovereign as well as for the citizen about how crime should be thought of and how crime should be dealt with and law enforcement.
This is kind of like some legal philosophy. I was actually enjoying it. It's very...
Yeah.
He gets into like very legal stuff.
Yeah, this is really kind of the foundation of a lot of our legal, thought, like his discussion of extenuating circumstances and things like that. So you see it here and we see a difference between the old natural law reasoning based on religion and what Hobbes is doing, because he says right away on 218 in chapter 27, the cause of crime is some defect in understanding. Now, previously, what would the cause of crime have been considered?
Wasn't that like a sin? It had something to do with sin. Like, he said that every crime is a sin, but not every sin is a crime. But originally it was just if you sin, it's a crime.
Originally it was, exactly.
But he kind of changed it.
Yeah, the cause of crime was your defective character. Okay, so to change this to you don't understand well enough is pretty revolutionary, and it again goes against the older, very Christian notion of law and government. It does come closer, I don't know if he intends this, but it comes closer to the Platonic view. Remember, Plato said, why do people do injustice? Because they don't understand justice well enough. So we have a return to that kind of rationalism with a modern twist. Why do people do this? Well, they just don't understand why it's in their self-interest to not do it.
He even cites Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero right there. As much as he hates them, he's using their idea.
Any old port in a storm, if they agree with me, I'm gonna cite them and the Bible too. He's very good at that. So he goes into this defect of understanding. He says there's 3 types, and this appears on the right-hand column of 218, first full paragraph, where he says the source of every crime is some defect of understanding or some error in reasoning or some sudden force of the passions. Defect in the understanding is ignorance. In reasoning, erroneous opinion. Again, ignorance is of 3 sorts: of the law, of the sovereign, and of the penalty. So ignorance of the law, or ignorance of the sovereign power, really understanding what the sovereign is there for, or not understanding the consequences of what you do. And his little example right below there is interesting, because right away he gives you one of those more modern notions about the law that becomes more prevalent. He talks about, what if somebody comes to your country from another country and begins to teach their religion? And of course this is presumed to be against your country's law. It wouldn't be in our country, but back then it was definitely a good presumption, right? What happens? Well, it's illegal and he should be stopped. But he does say, down at the bottom, but ignorance of the civil law shall excuse a man in a strange country till it be declared to him, because till then no civil law is binding. See? That wouldn't have been an excuse, even at his time, let alone earlier. If somebody comes into your country and teaches a so-called false religion, they're presumed to know, exactly what they're up to and to be engaging in a risky behavior. And it's okay to go nab them, do whatever you want. He's actually saying, until that person knows that your civil law prohibits teaching another religion, he's excused, or should be excused. This is how you should deal with somebody like that. So I guess you'd have to nab them, explain to them this is illegal, let them loose, and then if they do it again, okay? Do you see the difference in just, the tone here, as well as the spirit of it is different, in a way, the fact that he uses the religious example is pretty significant, because that's probably the one area where people would automatically say, no way, we have a right to go do whatever we want to this person. And even in that matter, because religion is so tied up with the civil law for Hobbes, it's the true religion because the law says it is. Therefore, everybody needs to be aware of the law before they can recognize that. Okay, so actually we have to inform people of the law. We can't just presume that they know. And this would be double for our citizens who are going to need to be educated about the law. And later on in the book, he emphasizes that the citizens must be taught the law in the pulpits, which I know sounds strange. We don't expect to go to a church or wherever we go and hear the law of our state or our country. But that's how tied together he saw these two being. So they should be preached the basic law in the pulpits. They should be reminded on every occasion of their duties as citizens. And that way, if they commit crime, it's in violation of their own understanding of the law. Now, as far as what crimes are the worst and the ones that the sovereign should guard against, it should come as no surprise that those are political crimes. The most dangerous crimes are those that might interfere with the sovereign's power. So we've already talked about how the sovereign can regulate or abolish these private armies and these monopolies and small religious groups that gather and could cause divisions. Literally any of them can be outlawed, and he says there's no greater crime than this, because the damage extends not just to the man or group of people that happen to be in charge, but by attacking the sovereign power, you attack everybody.
So would, say, some person going around preaching a religion other than the official religion, would that be more a political crime or more of a private crime?
It would be a political crime. And thanks for asking that question. In our world, it's definitely a private matter, and the worst that we could say about it is that it gives private offense. We wouldn't even call it a crime. But in his way of thinking, religion is the province of the state. The two should be one.
So would he consider it criticism then if you're trying to preach about some other religion pretty much?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a political crime because you're attacking the state itself when you attack the official religion.
It's pretty harsh to not even be allowed to criticize something.
Right. But once you criticize, you can get people on your side, right? And then pretty soon those people become...
See what he's thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but can you do that is really the question. Can you successfully stop people from doing this, or do you create a bigger problem by attacking them? We'll find Locke, basically concluding it can't be stopped this way. This is not a good solution because people simply will not respond to it the way that Hobbes intended.
Well, I feel like throwing in criticism and that can get pretty dangerous because then, any kind of questioning of the way that things are, saying, oh, it would be better if we did this instead of this, that could still be seen as criticism. And as, if he's saying political or worse than private, crimes, then that's like anything that you say has to be positive,
right? Even
if you're trying to better, I guess, what your situation is. So that I feel like that would get really, really dangerous if you weren't
as a
careful
citizen.
with that.
You'd have to be on guard when you. There's just a little hint of totalitarianism here. If Hobbes had access to the technology of keeping track of people and of propagandizing them and all of those things that 20th century, governments had that created these totalitarian governments, this type of reasoning would lead to that. And I think that he would probably approve. And that's the chilling part of Hobbes, is that he does want to control to the extent that he can the way people think and what they say. And he acknowledges that at his time, a lot of stuff can be done without the notice of the sovereign, because the sovereign and his men cannot be everywhere.
Yeah.
And there was no way, there's no phone tapping, there's no getting into their internet, there's no, lots of things. So if a person led a private life and occasionally complained, if he's living out in the country in some small town somewhere, he's probably not going to have the force of the law coming down on him. But if he's in a position of some influence, if he's in London, if he's, working for the barrister or whatever, then yes, he would have to be careful, because in those positions there might be somebody around who could report on him, and he would have enough influence to be worthy of notice. So the fear factor would extend to people who are more closely associated with the state and the state's apparatus at this point in time. But you could certainly extend this argument to more people the more the state becomes capable of reaching out. And when it comes to religion, any itinerant preacher who starts to make enough of a name for himself and get enough followers that officials in that area take note, that person's in danger, right? And other people, the people who follow him. Religion was the most threatening of the, ideological threats that he could see. Okay? So, any sort of crime that aims at diminishing the state power, obviously, this would include anybody who plots and schemes against the monarch, but it includes a lot else. All right, so he teaches that political crimes emerge through misunderstanding as well, and one of those misunderstandings is the teaching that this has always been the case. People have always been rebellious and disagreed and done what they want. I find this interesting. It reminds me of Polus in the Gorgias and the way that he looks at life. Down on the bottom left of 219, he says, first, by presumption of false principles, as when men from having observed how in all places and in all ages unjust actions have been authorized by the force and victories of those who have committed them, and that potent men, breaking through the cobweb of laws in their country, the weaker sort, and those that have failed in their enterprises, have been esteemed the only criminals, only people who fail have been seen as criminals, have therefore taken for their principles and grounds for their reasoning that justice is but a vain word, that whatsoever a man can get by his own industry and hazard is his own, and that the practice of all nations cannot be unjust, that examples of former times are good arguments of doing the like again, etc. Right? So you have these, politically sophisticated people who say, you know what, it's whatever I can get away with. If we're caught, yes, that's too bad. We're going to have some serious consequences. But a lot of times people get away with corruption and with, pushing back against the sovereign or even deposing them.
So it's basically, he's saying that there's this thought that, I don't know how to word it, like if you can get away with anything, then people think they should do it. They should just try to hide it, pretty much.
Yeah, you get away with what you can. And a lot of times, if you look back in history, people have gotten away with these political crimes and have gained great things as a result. So I'm going to ignore the sovereign's law and I'm going to plot anyway. So this type of thinking leads to errors in understanding that leads to these political crimes. Very, very political people, in other words, people who see the system as something that can get them somewhere that they can manipulate. Yeah. All right. Another source of error is seeing natural law the old-fashioned way, as a way of disagreeing with and comparing to civil law. And I wanted to point this out. We'll have to flip back to 212, because I tried to emphasize that this natural law teaching that Hobbes has is not binding in either nature or in civil society. And here's basically where he says that on the right of 212. He says, the interpretation of the laws of nature in a commonwealth dependeth not on the books of moral philosophy. The authority of writers, without the authority of the commonwealth, maketh not their opinion law, be they never so true. Okay? And he goes on to emphasize that. The civil law is the law. There is no other law. You cannot and should not use natural law to criticize the civil law. And this is the source of revolutions, okay? It was the source, in a way, of the English, the revolutions in England at his time, and the source of the 1688 revolution.
I'm a little confused, but isn't natural law the law that can never be broken? So he's just saying, like, if the sovereign creates a civil law, and if you think in any way it goes against the natural law, you just should not criticize it.
Right.
Unless the sovereign is asking you to hurt yourself.
Yeah, that's the one,
that's the
right.
most of
That
it.
one natural law of self-preservation is irrevocable, and nothing can be done about that because it's just so basic.
See, the only thing that confuses me is, like, what if a civil law clearly goes against, like, one of the natural laws, you know what I mean? Instead of, like, hurting yourself.
Right.
And then everybody was like, okay, this makes no sense. I mean, that would create confusion to me.
Yes and no. You know, the first two natural laws that he discusses, I guess the way to look at this is it's a hierarchy, and they're primary, okay? So you defend yourself, and you create and you seek peace if possible, and so you create the social contract. That's primary. And with the social contract, you cede over your rights to the sovereign, right? And then the sovereign has all the power to decide how to interpret the natural law, what to do with it, and even to ignore it, as long as he doesn't violate your self-preservation, right? Yes, it's a tough sell, because if you teach people the natural laws, which Hobbes seems to want to do, that
that's
situation
why,
will arise, right? Like the law against ingratitude, okay? What if the sovereign abuses his military and, you know, shows gross ingratitude towards them, though they serve him very well? This creates really bad feelings in the military, and then those bad feelings spread throughout society because everybody knows somebody in the military. And then criticisms will naturally arise, and more so if people are taught the natural law and that it's emphasized. So it's a problem for Hobbes that I'm not sure he can totally get around, right? But he wants people to acknowledge, you know, the primary law is we seek peace through the social contract. We have to understand, in order to have that peace, we have to let the sovereign interpret the natural law however he wants. And if what he does seems to go against it to us, nevertheless, we don't have the right to judge, and we shouldn't. Okay? The natural law gave him, through the social contract, that power. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily work, right? He's right that way of thinking is revolutionary. In other words, if people really believe there's this higher law, okay, this higher moral law that they can judge civil law by, it almost automatically gives people this attitude of, I'll change it. You know, if it's unjust, I'll change it. So he wants to avoid that, but he also wants to keep the natural law somehow. Probably he would have been better off just getting rid of the concept of natural law and being a complete positivist. But he wants to have...
Because isn't the natural law in itself, in a sense, slightly moral philosophy?
It is.
Yeah, that he doesn't want.
It is,
Yeah.
and he actually says the natural law is the complete moral law and
Yeah.
the law of God.
Yeah.
You know, so he wants to have it both ways in a way. He wants us to learn what we can from the natural law and for the sovereign to be informed by it. But he wants us to be complete positivists, on the other hand, saying whatever is, you know, codified and in writing, that's what the law is, and I can't judge. Not sure that psychologically people can handle that level of division of labor in their minds. It's sort of compartmentalization, you know, that people haven't been able to handle. And, you know, even like I said, the Civil War of his time, the ministers who were preaching, okay, against the government were appealing to natural law. He knows it. That's why he wants to try to avoid it. And again, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, after his death, definitely there was an appeal to natural law. It's not easy to stop people from doing this once they have it in their heads. So it's one of those ideas that you can't really control once it's there.
So is he wanting to actually teach this to the entire population, or is he only wanting to actually teach this to the aristocracy and the sovereign and those who are more higher up in power, who actually are going to have a larger impact on the politics?
He wants to teach the people higher up the full teaching. I think he expects those people in government to really understand this and absorb it and realize on what basis their power rests and so forth. But he does want, and this is new, he wants the average citizen to also understand the basics of it. And this is what will make them cooperative and make them see this new government in a different light and continue to be obedient. They really all need to know the social contract thinking. And he also says, basically the natural law. They need to understand this. They need to understand the basics so that they can buy into the system. They need to understand rightly what the natural law is for so they won't mistake it and do what they shouldn't do with it.
It seems to him that before anything else, though, he really wants them to realize that social contract of self-preservation, like that comes before.
Exactly.
anything
That's
else to him.
that's what
number
he-
one. Yeah.
wants people to keep in mind that their self-preservation is first and foremost, and he knows he's battling against the human tendency to flip those things upside down, to say my religion or my pride come before my self-preservation, right? So this really, a lot of it really rests on getting people to change their mind about that and see government as for their self-preservation. I know it sounds common sense, and it is in a way that it is for your self-preservation, but people very easily forget that, or else we wouldn't have so many wars and revolutions and all sorts of things. So the civil rights movement is a more modern day case of natural law being applied in a setting that's something that we understand better. Martin Luther King, as you probably know, used natural law reasoning in his speeches. He would call it nature's law and the law of God, sort of echoing the Declaration of Independence. He quoted the Bible in support of this idea. He quoted Thomas Aquinas. He didn't quote Hobbes. But he used this way of thinking, saying that a man-made law that doesn't reflect the higher law of nature and God is not a valid law. Okay? And on this basis, and then using Christian teaching to remind people not to be violent, he started this civil rights movement. So it's kind of an interesting thing to ask yourself, what would Hobbes say about the civil rights movement? It was not a revolution in the truest sense. There wasn't a war at this time, but there was violence. There was upheaval. What do you think he would say about it?
That's tricky.
I mean, thinking from his standpoint, he probably would not have really agreed with the civil rights movement, just because he probably would have agreed with the whites at the time that they didn't deserve laws because they weren't white.
Okay.
Most of them weren't
He might
males.
be just prejudiced.
Yes, which to them it wouldn't have been prejudice. It would have just been the way things were. They grew up thinking, others are other, and they're not going to be as smart. They're not going to be as
Right.
I don't know. It's really hard to tell, just because that was before slavery really became a really big thing. So
I don't think that Hobbes would have even ever have seen an
know.
African. They did not have slaves in England at Hobbes's time.
Yeah, I was going to say, so would he, because my whole thing, I don't think he'd agree with the violence, but
he probably would have.
my whole thing is like his thing with equality. Would he put, but the thing is, would he put them, like African Americans, would he put them on the same playing field back then? That's the question that I have. And if so, then he'd probably be okay with it, maybe because of his sense of equality, but I don't think he'd agree with the violence of it.
Well, even a lot of the men of that time, equality was for all white males. That didn't include women. That didn't include people who didn't speak English, basically.
But remember that
Yeah,
Hobbes
he
has
says
made men and women
women
are equal in the state of
Yeah,
nature.
which
So he's
is-
not exactly like
So,
everybody.
and that's why I'm saying,
It's
since he
confusing.
put them, I don't would it extend to everybody? That's my only question.
I think we can't know whether he would have prejudice because I've read everything Hobbes ever wrote, and I don't think he even acknowledges, doesn't discuss Africans. And this was before the slave trade even got good and started. So he wouldn't, another 50 years, and by Locke's time, it was a big deal. In Hobbes's time, if they had any, I've read that occasionally somebody would bring an African back and they'd have it sort of almost be like an exotic ornament, but not, no, there wasn't any, real conception of slavery.
So he might not even have been able to even answer.
Not as far as how he
subject,
felt about whether blacks and whites were intellectually equal. But, if we look at what he says about men and women, most people of his time thought that women were not intellectually equal to men. And basically Hobbes is saying, yeah, but in the state of nature, he doesn't even deal with intellectual differences. The real question is, are you a threat? Well, would Hobbes say that an African is not a threat in the state of nature? Probably not. An African is just like anybody else in the state of nature, regardless of what people would have thought about, their intellectual capabilities, etc. So the reasoning is there to support equality, and Hobbes does want all citizens in the Commonwealth to see themselves as equals under the sovereign. So there is that. He's actually anti-aristocratic in that sense. He doesn't like the idea of people being born into these privileged families thinking that they have some inherent claim to power. On the other hand, using that natural law teaching as a way of saying we're going to violate and disagree with and violate the laws of this country. Of course he wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that because those natural laws would be disagreeing with the civil laws.
Right.
In that instance, so yeah, he would not agree with that.
Because what did Martin Luther King do with them? He didn't want violent action, but he was basically
He wanted
saying...
a change in the law.
Right, civil disobedience, right?
And that would be criticism.
Even more than criticism. It was definitely criticism. But they did things like refuse to sit in the back of the bus, which was the law, or go into a white-only, lunch counter and sit at the counter. And then they'd get arrested, dragged out, and thrown in jail, and they didn't resist, but they were violating the law. So, yeah, Hobbes would never be able to go for that. Yeah, he would say, and of course this is what it's interesting. King dealt with this too, because he said white preachers at the time were telling him and other blacks, you should just keep trying to argue and just make your case and be patient. Whites are changing, and if you talk long enough, they'll listen to you, and the law will slowly change. And King basically said, look, we've waited a long, long time, and it seems to me that people are not listening and changing, and we have to do more than that. Hobbes would have been on the side of the white preachers in this case, saying, you know what, you still need to obey the law and be patient, and just, in his day, it would be going to the court and basically saying, Your Majesty, hear my grievance, and hoping for the best. And Martin Luther King was not interested in that because that had been done and it had failed. And yeah. Okay, so that's just an interesting question. I don't know if he would be against the civil rights movement on the basis of color, because one of the neat things about liberal thought is, even in his case, you're right, he probably wouldn't have even thought of it, but the reasoning pretty much extinguishes
Equality among everybody.
It extinguishes
That's
these
why it's
differences.
so interesting to me. I would.
Yeah, gender, race, ethnicity, even age to a great extent.
Because he basically just comes out and says, everybody's equal.
But does that only extend to other humans? Because oftentimes back then they didn't even see them as humans.
Right,
That's
maybe,
true.
yeah, and
That's
I
true.
have no way of knowing.
So
with Hobbes.
how far does that equality extend? Like, is it only to, what people thought of as humans or intellectual beings, or what? how far did he see that going?
Right, and I suppose that would be individual at that time as far as how each person saw people of other races, to the extent that they thought about them. We'll find Locke has thought about it.
Oh, he did. He does.
Yeah, he does. He does think about it, and he is not willing to objectify people of different races. In other words, he is not willing to quite say they're things, but he's sort of halfway there. He's struggling with it. And a lot of people of Locke's time, up to the time of the founding, the founding of the French Revolution, struggled with this because their reasoning, they could see the reasoning led to, recognition of Africans and people of other races as human beings, and if they're human beings, then they have to be equal. But yet having the sort of instinctual prejudice against people who were different than they were, and sometimes owning stake in companies that were involved in the slave trade. So they had these different thoughts going on at the same time. Thomas Jefferson had this struggle. He owned slaves, but in some of his writings, he's clearly recognizing their humanity at the same time, and he understands that there's a problem, like a real moral problem with this. And what do we do with slaves if we free them, became a question for people. We should free them, but now what would we do? And so, they really grapple with it. The true liberals grapple with it because they know that their reasoning contradicts slavery. It just can't, because they do start to recognize them as human beings. Mm-hmm. And in a way that makes it worse, a worse moral issue for them because, if you see these other human beings as not quite human, then you can objectify them and then you don't have as big of a moral problem, right? But if you say, women and blacks both have brains and they can reason and they have free will, they're human beings, then we have to explain why we're treating them very differently. And that becomes very hard to do. And John Stuart Mill, in his book we'll read on women, really grapples with this. And he basically finally comes out and says, there's no difference big enough to justify most of the laws and most of the practices that we have. And we just sort of need to see what women are capable of if we let them be free. So it ends up there, but it takes a long time, and in the process you get this messy stew. Like, some of our great heroes, Tom Paine, he was an anti-Semite and somewhat of a racist. He just couldn't quite, he was all for freedom and equality, but he just couldn't quite get there with everybody. And, they differed a lot. Another source of conflict is the aristocracy, the rich and the nobles. We've already talked about them, who claim special privileges for themselves. And this was based on long history that Hobbes said, well, now you're going to have to get used to thinking of yourself in a different way. Yes, you may have more money, but you're not more special. You're not more qualified just by being born into a particular family to share power. And he didn't want the sovereign to share power in a feudal system, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about this concept of glory. Hobbes says that those who teach these false philosophies about natural law and aristocratic privilege and so forth, that they are motivated by what he calls vainglory. And whole books have been written about exactly what Hobbes meant by glory and vainglory and what's all this. And I have a slide here that I took these terms from Gabriela Slomp, who wrote a book, Hobbes and the Political Philosophy of Glory. She tries to tease out the differences, and I generally agree with the distinctions that she makes. So glory itself is a legitimate type of pride, you might say, enjoying your superiority based on true ability. And it would happen in the case of an expert, for instance. You're a medical doctor and you know more than your patient, and you feel good about that, okay? But you don't know more about governing than the sovereign. So it's specific to what you actually know. False glory is when you enjoy others' admiration, but you don't have that true ability. So those who put themselves up to be experts, but they're not. And this would be, a great example of this would be the preacher who says he knows something about God. And he goes around and he teaches people his false teaching, but he doesn't know anything. In Hobbes' view, he's full of it. He's just making it up. And other people come to him, his flock comes to him, and they give him all this glory, but it's a false glory, okay? And it pumps him up, and then he does dangerous things with that. And then vainglory is the enjoying of imaginary dominance without any true achievement whatsoever. So this is a person who's self-important and who imagines to have influence that he doesn't have, okay? And Hobbes likes to throw the word vainglory and vainglorious around quite a bit as an insult. Vainglory comes from sheer vanity, and vainglorious people try to insert themselves into, and their opinions into whatever situation they can.
So
Okay.
what does he say that, or I guess, I don't know, have you gotten to yet what he says? So vainglory is the motivation for what exactly again?
It's for feeling that you're important enough to be heard,
Okay.
and that you have something to say, especially about the government.
Doesn't he say it has like a motivation like related to crime though, that it can cause you to?
Oh yes,
Okay.
it can cause you to break the law, right? It can cause you to break the law by feeling that you have something to say, or that you're worthy of disagreeing with the sovereign power, through gaining influence over others, or just doing what you want, right? An aristocrat could easily be a vainglorious person. Oh, I'm born of this very wealthy and influential family. I don't need to listen to the sovereign. My family was in power before his was, and his will be gone. And so I'll just do whatever I want. I'll gather up enough troops, and this type of self-importance and puffing oneself up leads to actions that can break the law and get you in trouble. So he says political crimes are the product of vainglory, because no one knows governance or should have an opinion about governance other than the sovereign. Okay. So those who commit treason are vainglorious people who do this for their deluded sense of self-importance. And how should we deal with those who commit treason? Those are people who disobey the sovereign and cause others to disobey, and in essence attack the sovereign power. Well, this is interesting because, again, it sort of resonates with our legal system today and our struggle with dealing with domestic terrorism, for instance, right? Or even terrorists on our soil who commit terrorist acts but are from other countries. We have this argument now about what should we do? Should we throw them in Guantanamo? Should we just kill them? Should we give them a trial, right? We've been arguing about this for years, right? Should we treat them like citizens because this will make us appear humane and civilized in the world, and we have nothing to fear because they'll be convicted? Or should we treat them like criminal or war combatants, basically? It shouldn't be a surprise that Hobbes comes down on the side of they're combatants, okay? He would not approve of putting them through a civil trial, okay? If a traitor attacks the state by plotting against the sovereign, or even worse, attacking the sovereign, he can be shot on the spot. He can be gotten rid of anyway because he has placed himself into a state of war. It's like he's gone back into the state of nature with the sovereign. He's voided the contract as far as he's concerned. He's not a part of that social contract, right? So then the sovereign can look at that individual like he would any other enemy of the state from another country. Even if he is a citizen of the country, he's no longer a citizen, see? So he wouldn't see any reason to treat him with kid gloves. Let's see, on 226 on the left, he says, but in declared hostility, all infliction of evil is lawful. Okay, this is on near the top of 226. From whence it followeth that if a subject shall by fact or word wittingly and deliberately deny the authority of the representative of the Commonwealth, he may lawfully be made to suffer whatsoever the representative will. For in denying subjection, he denies such punishment as the law hath ordained. Okay, so he's not subject to the law and legal punishments, and therefore suffers as an enemy of the Commonwealth, that is, according to the will of the representative. Okay, so that's how you deal with traitors, and that would not have been a controversial thing to say at all. It's interesting that he would even feel that he had to deal with this question. But he tries to deal with everything. Okay? Now, as far as non-political crimes, he has more leeway there. And again, we see some resonance with our own way of thinking. In crime, there can be what we call extenuating circumstances. Do you understand what that means? Okay, so it depends on, for instance, have you had a lot of time, and is there evidence that you've plotted and schemed and cooked up the crime that you commit, or is the crime done when you're in a rage all of a sudden, right? We still recognize this distinction in our law, right? An example of this is, a person comes home and finds their wife is in bed with their best friend, okay? And there's a baseball bat at hand. And he flips out and beats the guy to death. And these things happen.
It's a lot different than like premeditating and planning that you want to do something.
We recognize that still, right? I mean, that person is...
versus a first-degree murder.
Yes, absolutely, right. Because of the crime of passion, basically. There's a recognition of, what do they call it? Temporary insanity, too. That comes from that. You just become so immediately enraged. And then afterwards you realize what you've done. Now, Hobbes agrees that you can't totally excuse those crimes, because if you did, what would happen? If you said, under that circumstance you get no penalty whatsoever, what would happen?
Everybody would think that it would just be okay to go around killing people.
Yeah, you could easily make it look like, like you just entered in on the scene when you didn't, right? You could make it look like a crime of passion, or you could make that argument. So there's got to be some sort of penalty, or you'll have the Wild West back again. But on the other hand, it's not just to treat the cold, scheming murderer in the same way as the person or the person who kills while under attack. In the street you get robbed and somebody's taking your possessions and you're in fear of your life and you kill that person. That's self-defense. You may need to have some sort of penalties, again, so that you prevent a Wild West atmosphere, but you certainly are not as guilty as if you've planned and plotted to murder somebody. Okay, so that's interesting. Of course, the sovereign can do whatever he wants. He can come up with different laws than these, but these are what Hobbes considers to be the best practice. Okay, so there's these mitigating circumstances that can occur. And I guess that would be the reason for judges, right? All right. On the property angle, there's some interesting teachings here. Moving from crimes to rights, and the question of, do people have a right to their property? Locke is going to answer yes. You have a right not only to your self-preservation and your bodily well-being.
He was really big on that, wasn't he?
He's really big on that. You mix your body with the property through labor, it becomes your property. And not even the sovereign power can take it away from you without your consent. Hobbes does not agree, okay? Because if you have absolute control over your property, you have power that you can use against the sovereign. Okay, then he has to come and ask you, for taxes, or, he has to go through some mechanism to try to convince you that he needs your property, okay? And leading to the question of what Hobbes would say about eminent domain, the argument in our government that sometimes government does have the power to not get your consent and take your property, which the Supreme Court has now extended to commercial development in cities, right? Which was an interesting and controversial move. So Hobbes would probably totally agree with that. It wouldn't go far enough, but he would definitely agree that the government should have the power to take your property if necessary, and not necessarily compensate you. We have this requirement that people be justly compensated, although lots of times the people who have this happen to them don't think they've been justly compensated. Okay? I don't think Hobbes would add that, we had development happen here, the 4th Street area, which is now the, it has Bed Bath & Beyond and all those apartment complexes and everything.
Hey, didn't that used to be, that wasn't there for a
That wasn't
long
there.
time,
There
right?
were homes there. There were some businesses there, some old businesses that have been around forever, but they weren't doing very well. They weren't nice. And the city used the eminent domain law to take that property, and they compensated them based on what their current evaluation was for their property, not the value that the property would become, obviously. And it wasn't worth much. It was worth more to them, they argued, continuing to run their business. There was an international grocery store there, for instance. And for them to move, they did move out on Tuttle Creek Boulevard, further out of town, which is arguably a less desirable location, but it was the only thing they could afford.
Yeah.
So they felt like they weren't justly compensated, and they were forced to move. And imagine it would feel pretty bad. We also have a dam, and long before I was here, they took a lot of people's farms and homes, and there was a church and a graveyard in that area, and they confiscated all of that. They moved the graves and bought out all the people, and then filled that up with water. There's literally homes underwater down there.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, people were not happy about that. No. But without that power, which even our government exercises in a democratic setting, there was a lot that government couldn't do. And the question for us is, where should it extend to commercial, not the dam, actually, or highways? Because if government can't build dams and highways, we can't grow, basically. We can't become better. Anyway, long story short, that reasoning is totally fine with Hobbes, because in Hobbes' view, the sovereign owns everything. He is the ultimate arbiter of property, and he is the guarantor of your right to have property, right? So you have it because he gives it to you, and he can take it away. All right, we're out of time.